Disasters can happen at any time with very little and sometimes no warning. Hurricanes, earthquakes, tsunamis, flood, volcanoes, tornadoes, and fire are a fresh reminder that hazards can strike at any time, and no area of the country is immune. Whenever a hazard is approaching or occurring, take the necessary precautions to keep you and your family safe and sound. Pay close attention to all bulletins and updates from the Department of Emergency Management, and make sure you have an adequate supply of non-perishable items, medication, and plenty of water, as well as knowing the location of your nearest emergency shelter. Disasters can occur in the blink of an eye. The right precautions could save your life. Prepare and be aware. This message is brought to you by the Department of Emergency Management.
Very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, we're 25 days into the 2020 Atlantic hurricane season, which forecasters have predicted will be above normal. So for the next 6 months, Barbados and our brothers and sisters in the Caribbean, well, we have to be on our guard. Last year, the IDB reported an estimated $3.4 billion in damage caused by Hurricane Dorian. And from media reports in the Bahamas, which was severely impacted by that system, they saw a way to go before recovery. In the years before, we had Hurricane and Irma, which wreaked havoc on Dominica and some of the other islands in the Caribbean. And here in Barbados, well, we need to at a tropical wave or even less in these Category 4 systems that we mentioned above have challenged severe wind damage, broken roads. I know this is not new, certainly not for our panelists and not our audience either. So it is context that I'd like to welcome you to Real Talk in the Face of Danger, the second webinar hosted by the Department of Emergency Management at Barbados Light Power. And I'll be your moderator this evening. And I'm joined by 3 panelists this evening who will give us that real talk on what goes into preparing Barbados for a hurricane. So allow me to introduce them. We have Dr. Nneka Archer, an engineering manager at Barbados Light Power Company Limited. We also have Mr. Selwyn Brooks, consultant at the Department of Emergency Management, and Mr. Winford Austin, disaster management officer at the Barbados Red Cross. And on our screen, you will also see Bonnie Leonce, who is interpreting for the deaf. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Now, every year we're told to prepare our households for the hurricane season, but what exactly does that preparedness look like through the lens of essential services, especially when there is a warning of a season that is possibly going to be above normal? Well, that's what we're going to talk about for the next hour, and I'd like to open with Dr. Archer. I'm volunteering you to be our opener this evening as we're talking about hurricane preparedness. And we know that volunteerism is important at this time of year especially. So tell me, Dr. Archer, what does hurricane planning and hurricane preparedness look like for you and the others at the Barbados Light Power Company Limited?
So good night again, everyone. So I would have joined the company 17 years ago. I'm sure hurricane plans predated me. There's a whole hurricane plan so with procedures relating to a hurricane, and there's a hurricane team with persons with responsibilities across the organization. So we start with the obvious, we have the generation part, we have persons from the generation, then we have persons from the operations department. We have a lot of external plants, so in that goes the tree trimming, make sure our maintenance is up. We also make sure all the substations are up to date. We do the checks, make sure everything is in check. We meet as a team. Then there are other groups like the procurement to make sure we have hurricane stock. And later on in the evening, we could talk about that, hurricane stock. Then we have the communications team and also the HR team. Now, when people think about hurricanes and prepare the SAS Light and Power, we do the tree trimming, we check the plant, make sure the plant is in good working order, respect the plant, respect our assets and what's not dependent on sustaining certain amount of winds. In the case of what happened with Dominica, regardless of what you expect, you might come about some sort of damage. But another important part, which we learned, especially being part of a group, including Domla, Grand Bahamas, and Nova Scotia, we were able to update or tweak our hurricane plans based on the experiences from them. And another important aspect, I know we were going to the technical parts about the tree trimming and the poles. A very, very important key part is the human resources element of it and the communication. So in a hurricane, when we talk about restoration, you need people to be there in order to do the restoration effort. So the HR plays a critical role in this also, a role which a lot of organizations probably do focus on, making sure they know how to contact all the employees. Within recent times, based on the experiences from the same Dominica, we understand there's certain things you can have, you need to might have as an organization. I mean, if you can afford it, like we started to have a lot of educational sessions on insurances, hurricane insurances for employees. We started to talk about having enough hurricane ration for persons who would actually stay on and ride out the hurricane, and then also some sort of employee assistance programs because when we visited Dominica, which we will probably get into later on in discussion, we had employees who had a whole set of devastation at their home. So you need those employees to come in and assist. So therefore, there were things like storing, having tarpaulins, the organization having a set of tarpaulins, reaching out to contractors that can assist in case employees' homes are damaged because employees will need to make sure their home is secure, the family is comfortable to make their mind at ease in order to come in and assist with the restoration. So generally, as you say, we do the usual thing for years, checking the plant, tree trimming, maintenance, checking generation facilities, checking the substations, the transmission and distribution. But we also now have the added benefit of making sure we have a plan in place for our employees who will be our frontline workers.
Dr. Archer, thank you very much for that comprehensive opening. And as we are on, I'm glad that you stopped there talking about employees and people because sometimes people forget the human element, the fact that you are an essential worker. You have to make sure that the country is running properly, but you have to do that concerned about your family and whether they are safe and whether your home is safe and whether once you secure somewhere you have somewhere else to go. So I'm going to introduce now Mr. Brooks on this element of people and people working within this atmosphere. I'm aware of your background, Mr. Brooks, with the DEOs, the District Emergency Organizations, especially in St. James, where you have really given unmatched service, if I may describe it that way. What is hurricane planning and preparedness looking like for the DEM in general? And then I want to get into the DEOs specifically.
Well, the Department of Emergency Management who has the overarching responsibility of sensitizing the country and various agencies in terms of how they will mobilize their respective areas to make sure that the country is prepared. So you will find around this time in the year, everyone is relatively busy trying to make sure that their plans and procedures are tweeted and the various supplies and various mechanisms are put in place so that persons will be able to respond to the likely impact that we may, as this year is already forecasted to be above average. In terms for the communities, that is where the district emergency organization can play a pivotal role in terms of sensitizing the various residents across the country as to what are their functions and the need to take the hurricane preparedness rather seriously and therefore to prepare themselves, families, make sure you have adequate supplies, make sure you have various assessment of your environment, those persons who live in flood prone areas to be able to identify should they need to evacuate, they will know where the evacuation routes are. Those persons who will need to go to shelter, first that you will want to consider alternative shelters at family or friends as a first choice. But should you have to rely on the shelter system that you know where you have to go, make sure you have your personal supplies, make sure that those vulnerable persons are accounted for in the event if we have to offer assistance to them. So there's a quite variety of areas that the DOs through the DM will be, especially at this time of the year, focusing on as we prepare the country for what is inevitably one day would be some level of impact.
Right. And Mr. Austin as well, the Barbados Red Cross is always active. What is preparing and planning for you for a system at this time of year?
Hi, Lisa. Good evening, fellow panelists, and to the audience out there. Our planning is focusing, number one, making sure that we do have our capability and capacity to respond should there be any adverse impact from any weather system. That means making sure we have certain stock on hand. We also work very closely with the DEM and with the officers out there. And it's mainly in providing some assistance in training. In particular, what we do is called the Community Disaster Response Training. And that is some of the stuff that we focus our preparation efforts in. Because of the COVID 19 context, we couldn't be as active out in the community as we would normally be. But this year, just actually last week, we finished 2 days of community disaster response training to the DEOs and other community groups within the island. So that is where our focus for preparation is concerned. Working with the DEM through the DEOs, uh, getting the message out there that, take these warnings seriously when they do come along. All it takes is one system. It doesn't take 3 or 4 systems to impact Bermuda. Correction, that's Barbados. Bermuda is my former hometown, so it only takes one system to impact the island, right? So take those warnings seriously when they come from the Met Office, from the DEM, and at the community level, know what is a hazard to your community. That is the message that we
Mhm.
want to get out there, because every community in Barbados is different. So know what your hazards are and prepare for those hazards.
Right. Very good point, Mr. Austin. And either you yourself or Mr. Brooks, I think, can come in here because I'm interested in finding out some more about training, especially at the community level. Mr. Austin, you were just talking about a 2-day session that you finished. Overall, Mr. Brooks, what type of training is available for Barbadians who are interested in helping out in times of disaster? And more importantly, I think, what level of interest is there among people to volunteer and to be part of efforts to safeguard communities and help build them back when a possible impact is over?
Well, the level of training is specifically looking at preparing the DOs across the island to prepare to respond to any the various hazards that are likely to be impacted the country. Communication, damage assessment, shelter management, community profiling, first aid are some of the basics. But that would inevitably, once an officer is trained to certain levels, they are equipped with the skills that they will be able to interface not only with the individual units, but also with the other regulatory agencies that we will have to interact with from time to time. Unfortunately, very much when you go into the field, you hear the comment, but how much you're going to be paid. And this is usually a comment that you hear coming from citizens, and especially in some areas. But I think that the attitude now, what has happened during the Bahamas and what has happened in Dominica, I think residents in Barbados who have a very high level of complacency to emergency and what they need to do need to recognize that we will be impacted someday. And it is not an issue of volunteering and what you're going to be paid. The reality is that if Barbados is impacted, we all suffer based on our level of preparedness or lack of. And therefore, the rallying call has to be continued to be made that we need to prepare for inevitable when Barbados is going to be impacted. And the communities, the country can only be as resilient as much as our communities start. The community resilience has to start from the respective communities, and that will build to your parish, and then the parish will build to the country, and it has to be seen as a responsibility. It is not the responsibility of the Department of Emergency Management to do this or to do that, when in actual fact, residents are failing to various warning that they will get from time to time. And the general excuse is that we expect some person else to do something for us. But I think the time has come for Bajans especially to understand that each one has to play their part. And it starts, and if we can collectively get the level of community resilience at acceptable levels, I think we will fare a little better in the event if we are impacted by a hurricane, of which you have warning. But there are other hazards that does not give you that luxury to give you a warning that you can do this and do that. So we must be prepared all year round, and especially during the hurricane season, for inevitable what can happen if a system impacts us.
Dr. Archer, what in a situation where we're warned that there is a pending system coming, how does Light and Power mobilize? I know you talked about specking assets and those types of things. Can you explain that a little bit for us? How do you mobilize to prepare yourself in the event that something hits?
So when we talk about latent power mobilizing now, in the event that something hits, we are talking about response from an employee perspective. When I talk about specing assets, that has to happen beforehand. So, for example, not to get too technical, on our system, we have poles. You see different size poles out there. We have programs we can run in order to spec our poles to handle a particular wind. Like 100 miles, 120 miles per hour wind. So that's what I mean by specing assets. When we now hear about a hurricane, there's no time to spec assets or anything. It is about our response. That's where we go in to decide, okay, who, prepare now. Now we did simulations. I know I forgot to mention we do simulations, and our simulations now have to be in light of COVID. So our last simulation that we did as a team had to do with responding during COVID. Persons are working from at home, how they will get in, if the area is impassable, if the telecommunications is down. We have satellite phones. So when we talk about response, when we get that response, we're talking about how we mobilize our people. Right? We decide like who stays in. We will have people who have to ride out the storm because we have a 24/7. Is if the staff up, double up there. Some other persons ride out the storm. We have representatives at DEM, and then everybody else stays home until you have the technical all clear. It is all about being safe also. So we will not have people out there working with winds. We have instruments to check the wind, and when the wind get over a certain amount, we ask all persons to come in and sit down until the technical all clear is given. So when we talk about response, we more people making sure everybody is aware of what they need to do, and everyone pretty much is aware. The thing about response is that if people are able to respond, that's the main thing during a hurricane. I'm touching back. A colleague and I actually visited Dominica. Oh my God, that was an experience. I know we said our turn will come. That's something I don't want to experience in our lifetime. You had employees there. When we talk about a society, the society was willing to work together to get the system back up. You had employees who said they got up at 5 o'clock and walked to work for an hour and a half in order to come in, because they know if they stay at home, it makes no sense because they're not going to get through the restoration as efficient as possible. I don't like to talk about speed in restoration for so many different reasons. So I think in a crisis mode, I think generally as a society, people will come together and want to assist. It's just to understand how to assist. And that's probably where the training and the communication come. But I think as a society, if you see that level of devastation, persons will want to assist.
I'm glad you talked about actually seeing it and seeing the experience. One of the things that was discussed post Dorian in Bahamas and Irma and Maria in Dominica was the mental fallout, I guess, for lack of a better word, how people are impacted mentally, seeing that destruction and considering the overwhelming task of having to rebuild, seeing basically all of their lives destroyed right in front of them. That's a mammoth undertaking for people to wrap their heads around. How do you go about preparing for and possibly dealing with that? I don't know if you want to jump in here, Mr. Austin.
Uh, and that's by, through stress management, training in stress management. And in the Red Cross, we provide training in social support, psychological first aid. All these are the different terms that you hear bandied around. But ultimately, that
Mm-hmm.
is what it is. It is, provide training in stress management. How can you manage your stress? How can you identify stress in others? And what are the coping mechanisms that you have? Because if you don't have proper coping mechanisms, when a system impact, a crisis impacts you, right, you will be struggling, right? Because those hazards, whether it's a hurricane, whatever it is, it will knock you offside. And if you have nothing to fall back on, you will struggle. And that is where social support comes in from the Red Cross side, from the community. We have a lot of, different counselors, uh, mental health professionals out there. They are the ones that can come in and assist people. But before they come in, it is what you need up front. So you need to be educated
Right.
on what, especially disaster stress. Dr. Archer mentioned, the impact, seeing what people in Dominica were going through. I had a personal experience of Hurricane Fabian in Bermuda in 2003 when we lost 4 lives, and 3 of them were colleagues of mine as police officers. So you can
Oh, wow.
imagine what impact that was having, not only on the individual families that lost lives, but the community where now you've had a collective loss of life, and an organization where you are supposed to be the heroes and the rescuers, you are the ones who've lost lives. So we had good support systems in place, that we were able to rebound. Mr. Brooks talked about being resilient. So all these are things that when you have these support mechanisms in place up front, you can rebound, you can be resilient to get through these storms. You can't stop the storm from coming, but you can lessen the impact that they have on you psychologically for sure.
Right. Mr. Brooks, in terms of psychological preparedness, um, thing the DM concentrates on, especially for its volunteers, and a few years back too, there was discussion about whether insurance could be provided for DEO members who are among the first responders in their communities, which is one of the reasons why the DEOs were set up in the first place. So, in terms of some kind of psychological support or mental support, insurance, those types of things, are those things being discussed?
Yeah, matter of insurance has come up from time to time. But when you are looking at insuring an entity or an individual, there are a number of factors that the most insurance companies will want to consider. What is the level of training and the competence of the persons, and what is the level of risk of a person who is trained or who is not trained, and what is likely to happen? So I think these are issues that will continue to be discussed until we have been able to iron them out, because you have units that are functioning at different levels, have persons who are at various levels in their skill sets. So until we have been able to set certain standards and try to bring all of the individual units up to the required level of training and therefore the level of competence that is expected, I think it is only then that you can realistically look in terms of offering insurance in terms for the persons who are involved. In terms of the
Right.
psychological assessment, it is very important that as we prepare ourselves, and you'll see the examples of what has happened in Dominica. Even when I was there 3 years ago after Maria, I have never seen that level of devastation anywhere else. And sometimes,
Okay.
unless you are prepared unless you have a certain level of training that you can anticipate what can happen, you can prepare yourself thus far. But as the reality is when you see the level of devastation that it can humble you to recognize that the magnitude that can result from the level of a hurricane that Dominica has experienced. But I think
Right.
the Department of the over the last couple of years, the Department of Emergency Management have been seeking to create that wholesome environment in which the DOs can have some level of comfort. And even now, we are embarking on a number of training initiatives that will bring the level of competence and the level of response capacity at acceptable levels. And I think it is only when we have done that that realistically we can then expect some persons to offer the level of insurance that may be needed.
Okay, fair enough. Now, we've talked about preparedness, preparing for an impact if it happens. We know that something is developing off of Barbados. We know that it is intensifying, so we know we have to put certain things in place. One of the things that is put in place is the Emergency Operations Center, which is usually at the DEM's headquarters in Warrens. Now, I've spent many a night when attending or one has started affecting Barbados at DEM headquarters, covering what happens there. I would like you, Mr. Brooks, to tell Barbados, tell our viewers and our listeners exactly what happens at the DEM once the Emergency Operations Center is stood up. What is the Emergency Operations Center and what is your role?
The Emergency Operations Center is set up and the DM has the overarching responsibility. You will find representatives from the various entities, government departments, private sector, utilities, who their chief or their key persons who are in the position to make the necessary decisions and to hear the reports coming back in from their respective units as the information comes into the USC. It is a center where all of the information is lodged, and because you have all the stakeholders positioned there, they can have a realistic understanding of what is happening at the time, and therefore then make the pertinent decisions that is needed as those decisions are filtered down. The DOs do not currently sit at the EOC at this present moment because I don't think they may be necessary because the DOs are better suited to remain in the community so that as the information comes in from the EOC and it is then filtered down to us, that we can then have an understanding what is the level of impact throughout the country, and based on where you are positioned in terms of your unit, you can then offer the appropriate response when the all clear is given or when the instruction is given that you are safe to do so. But the AOC is the
Right.
overarching entity that actually manages and sieves out all the information as it comes in, and it is uniquely poised to make the required decisions that is needed to control and to manage what is happening.
So when you talk about stakeholders who are involved at the EOC level, you're talking about police, you're talking about fire, various government departments, those types of people. Yes?
Yes, that is correct. The police, the
Um,
fire,
mhm,
medical personnel, some persons from the private sector, Ministry of Agriculture. There's a whole host of
mhm.
departments and entities that they will have their representatives their position so that they can make the appropriate decisions based on what happens and what comes in.
Right. So, Archer, once the light number gets a call, I'm not sure whether you are involved in the EOC, but once you get a call, is down, it's sparking, or a tree has fallen across the road and it's pulled down poles, you get the all clear that it's safe to go out, it's safe to deploy crews. Explain to our participants. I know that we're going on Facebook, we're going live on Facebook. We also want to invite some questions. If any of our participants have questions for our panelists, feel free to send. Have people standing by monitoring on our social media to pass them. I can pass them on to the panelists. So back to the question. Sorry. Once you get a report that something has happened, then what do you do? What is the process for investment? What is that?
Right. So now, once we get in, okay. So we have a plan. Depends. I can answer this what we did in the past. I can answer it with respect to the team we're on with the DM, facilitated with the DM, a rapid response assessment team. But let's talk about what actually happened in the past. What happens is that the reports are collated in what we call our emergency section. We have a 24-hour emergency section, which is SCADA. Once the all clear is given, you have those assessments coming in from before, but then we also have persons responsible for particular areas and part of the hurricane plan. Each We have people listed to take care of all over the island to be able to go and do a cursory assessment of the damage coming from home. So maybe if I live in St. Philip, my area will be the main line from St. Philip leading back into the company. So on your way in, you assess the level of damage and you take a note of that. Then we have, going forward, coming out of the experiences or our lessons learned from Dominica, we also have a group of assessors. So we have those people doing, as they come in, doing a high level assessment because they have different roles or functions within the plan. Then we have persons responsible for actually doing assessments. So that high level assessment will help us then to deploy the assessor to do a more detailed inspection. So that's one way, that's what we've done. Sitting on the team now, we have a team called a rapid response utilizing drones. Barbados Light Power sits on that team. We have the Barbados Police Force who have done significant work with drones. We have members of the Coast Guard, a whole set of different entities sitting there. We have access to like 21 drones. And the whole idea is that the drones will be used to do a rapid assessment, and that can also be used by all other entities in order to do their level of assessment. So the idea is we meet every 2 weeks, and the plan is to have each person, the island, divided up among the different entities who have drones, and they will be responsible for flying the drone, and the police who manage this whole thing has a way in which they will pull all that information into a YouTube or some sort of framework and share it with the various entities. So that's called a rapid response. And you would imagine having an area view of an assessment would actually be improve the efficiencies in order to then take that assessment and do your planning for execution of restoration, as opposed to a person driving. So there's a rapid response team, and I think the assessments will be done within 12 hours or so. Don't quote me on that. Quickly after the technical all clear is given.
Right. Mr. Archer. No, Mr. Austin. Sorry. Where does the cross fit into all of this? You've done your preparation. You're getting yourself ready in the event that something strikes. A system hits. What is next for the Red Cross?
One thing that we got to be mindful of is the Red Cross is really an auxiliary to government. We support government. We don't try to take over anything from government agencies, entities. So DM is the one that takes the lead, and we really would follow DM lead and what they require from the Red Cross. But a system will impact Barbados. Where will we start? Because we are part of an international organization, we will contact the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies just to let them be aware that Barbados is likely to be impacted by whatever system it is and what are the potential impacts likely to be. There is where we start mobilizing our international connections, our international resources in case they are needed here for the island. Right? What we will do in-house then, our volunteers, Mr. Brooks will talk about volunteers from the DO side. The Red Cross, the work of the Red Cross depends heavily on volunteers. Uh, we are in contact with our volunteers. They are in the community, and there are your first responders, those people out in the community. So before the official agencies get out there, a system hits, it's the people in the community that can start feeding in different reports and stuff to whatever organization they are before the official first responders get up there. So our volunteers play a key role in that regard. Uh, we also stand by to provide first aid assistance, whatever form it is. First aid is one of the things that our volunteers have across the board. It's a must. Also, for shelter management, it's something that we partner with DM through the Ministry of Education to assist in shelter management where it's needed, and also with the QEH to assist in any uh, for sale stuff that may be needed as well as assistant. They, there's movement of any large movement of patients and stuff at the QEH. So those are our ways to really get up there if there's a direct impact, first and foremost, for the Barbados Red Cross.
What I'd be interested in from you and Mr. Brooks in terms of volunteers and this an appetite for volunteerism among Barbadians, is it there? Is it at a level that you're satisfied with? Is it time to put out a mass call for volunteers?
I'll
Yes,
take
there
that one.
is. Okay, go ahead.
Go
Go
ahead.
ahead. I think there is that need for persons to recognize and that they need to give back to the country and they need to share what the country is experiencing. Let us look at the recent what we're going through now with the COVID. No one knows or no one knew expected what COVID brought to us. And I think we must understand as a society, we have been able to establish and build certain levels of comfort. And for persons to sit back and always believe that the government of the day, or that the Department of Emergency Management, or that the Red Cross, or whatever entity that has some level of responsibility for some things that happens in the country, I think that we need to develop the concept that we who live here, if Barbados is impacted, we all will be impacted. And if we can come together and if we can take this opportunity to make a rallying call that we need to get persons in the various communities more involved in the district organizations across the country. Because when we speak about community resilience, it has to start with our persons who reside in the various communities. And therefore, it makes no sense continuing to believe that it's somebody else's responsibility to do this and do that. And volunteerism is what can be used to drive the process to acceptable levels that we will build that level of resilience that we need. It makes no sense to person else, or I don't get paid. You will not get paid, but when the impact comes and when the impact happens, what are you going to do? Are you going to wait until something happens? What we can do is to come on board, join the district emergency organizations across the various communities. You will be able to access varying levels of training that will make your contribution very worthwhile in terms of protecting and offering society that level of comfort to knowing that we are likely to be able to respond to the levels of impact because we can't stop the system from coming. And I dare say, when Barbados is impacted, we need to build that level of community resilience. And that can only be done and strengthened by increasing the level of volunteerism. I asked a question. Suppose we have the population of Barbados. If each person on a monthly basis was going to decide that they're going to volunteer, say 10 hours a month, I think if you accumulate those hours, it can redound to a significant number of hours in terms of once that volunteerism is properly structured and centered to respect our relatively results, I think the country will do a lot better.
Mr. Austin, let me ask you on this of volunteers and the need for volunteers. Red Cross offers training, but some of it people have to pay for. Is it affordable Is it offered at an affordable level that we can say, well, yes, I can factor this in. I want to give the country. We want to make sure that we can, back up after an event happens.
Yeah.
If the training is not accessible, then that kind of makes it a moot point.
Yeah, and the thing about any trainings at all, it all depends on what type of training that is. It all trainings are doesn't have a cost attached to it, and especially in this current context of COVID-19, where a lot of training now is being provided online. We find that we can provide a lot more training online, reach a lot more people. It doesn't cost as if you were doing face-to-face trainings. So those are always going to be factors that come in, but there are all different types of training that can be offered that speaks to community disaster response and management, so that you don't have to incur a cost. And the Red Cross will always look at ways where we can either absorb it or we can find things that are not cost prohibitive to anyone joining, whether as a volunteer or just for a specific training. The whole question about volunteers again there is that when we're all pulling from the same pool of people. Don't care what organization it is, don't care what department agency, we're all generally pulling from the same pool of people. And that pool is shrinking. Right? So what we have to do to get volunteers now is to make it more attractive to them, and not attractive in just ordering incentive to, hey, come and get something. But we have to do things that could retain their interest. There must be development
What?
that
We say that a lot. We say a lot that we need to attract people. We need to attract fresh blood. As you're pulling from the same pool and it's getting smaller, what do you do to make it attractive? What do you offer?
it's I don't think, and for some place like the Red Cross, I think traditionally we haven't really gone up there and offer people stuff as such. It's been like, okay, I am the Red Cross, you know my name, so come to me. Now we have to go to people, right? We let them know Mr. talking about the community resilient aspect and what being a Red Cross volunteer would do to improve your community, improve your personal life, improve your chances of overcoming any adversity. Those are some of the trainings that the Red Cross do offer you. And if you have that training, you're starting above the curve when a negative experience comes along. So those are the things, development opportunities that come along to international travel. Dr. Archer has been talking about her experiences in Dominica. Mr. Brooks, the same thing. You get these experiences when you become part of organizations, and these are the things that are off that you get by coming in. So there are incentives that come with it. They're not they're not things that you just come out and say, oh, let me get this to wear a shirt or just to look good. But there are things that can benefit you once you join, and once you join up, let them know that these are the things that we offer. But have a development plan for when they come in, so that they're not, oh, nothing has happened in the last 2 or 3 years, so I'm gone. So that's what we have to guard against.
Mm-hmm.
But if we can add to that, Lisa, I think that the incentives that we need to portray to the individuals when we ask you to come in and volunteer, as just as Richard has indicated, the training that you have received, that has to be seen as an incentive. And how utilize that training to help yourself and your family, because we have had a number of DOs who have used this level of training to get back into their respective workplaces, and who have, by so demonstrating that they have a certain level of capacities, it has enhanced their opportunities to raise their ranks up, because they have been able to demonstrate that they have certain qualities, certain disciplines, and a disciplined approach to what you do. So I think that sometimes people do not see the wider picture when they talk about volunteers. But there is a lot of benefits being a volunteer, and more often, if you have that desire to serve your various communities, I think you get the resounding feeling of knowing that you were able to help your fellow man or your fellow citizen. Is you cannot put a cost to that, because at some point in time you will want to think that if you were in a disadvantaged position, that someone would have been able to offer you the same level of expectancy that which what you are requiring. So I think we now have to look in volunteering differently. Of course, we need to provide certain resources and training so as to make the volunteers feel a little bit more comfortable. And that is where some of the greatest challenges are, because as a society, people don't always offer the level of resource and finance that we will want at any particular point. But we can't just throw our hands up in the air. We have to continue to look and see what we can do, because we all live here in this small country and we need to build that level of capacity. And it could only be done with the enhancement of persons volunteering to serve their country.
If people are coming forward for that training that you're talking about, Mr. Brooke and Mr. Austin, what are the specific areas that they would be trained in?
But if you're looking at emergency response, let us look at what likely to happens if Barbados is impacted. There will be flooding. There is quite a possibility that as a result of the flooding, people may have to evacuate from their homes. They may need to go to a shelter. In the process of the evacuation, they may incur a number of injuries. When Barbados is impacted, we need to assess what is the level of damage. So if you look at those 5 scenarios, the basic training is usually held in how will we assist in the process of managing the shelters, what level of assistance we can offer as a first aider, what level of training and that we can in turn to go into our various communities and help develop the evacuation plans and identify the safe evacuation routes in the event of flooding or any other impact that is likely to be need in evacuation. Communications, because we can't rely on the cell phones, which we have become so reliant on in the event if something happens and the systems are down. So we have to offer that level of training to communicate, not only among ourselves, but to communicate back with parent body, the DM. So these are some of the basic training areas that the volunteers will be trained in so that they will have what is required to fulfill the roles that they're expected to carry out. So the training is specifically responsibility. And then there's another area of psychological first aid. That is one area that is not as rampant as maybe persons would like. But as first responders, you have to relate to what you see and what you are seeing on the ground, and what are the conditions and the level of impact. So it affects you as well. So there's a whole range, and I'm quite certain Richard will be able to expand on this. There's a whole range of areas that we now need to make sure that those persons are adequately trained. The trained person are more likely to give you the level of response that you want. They will respond, they will not react.
This is true. We have I'm gonna let Mr. Austin jump in there, but we have a question from one of our Facebook viewers. They want to know if the COVID-19 has lessened the interest in volunteerism.
The COVID has put, I wouldn't say it has lessened. I think the COVID experience had instilled a certain level of fear and uncertainty in across the country. When we see what has happened in the outside world, who have been devastated more than us, but even the numbers that we have encountered, is some level of devastation for us as a small community. So I think there's a certain level of fear of persons don't want it to be contracted, and justifiably so, and persons are a bit reluctant to volunteer at this point in time, especially with that level of uncertainty as to whether they will be able to contract the virus. But the virus is going to be here with us. It is not going anywhere. And we now have to appreciate that we will have a new norm and we have to cope with it. The doctors and the nurses and the persons at the front end of any emergency, once you are trained, build a level of confidence that you can go to the front line and execute what you have been trained to do. And once you have done that, I think you will not fear You will not fear as a trained person. So it's when you're in doubt is where you have that level of fear.
Dr. Archer, I know that the Light and Power, with your trained, specially trained personnel, would perhaps the same type of fear that the average Barbadian would have, perhaps coming out and volunteering. But how have you tailored your response to fit into the COVID-19 context?
So right now, with COVID-19, we had persons working around the clock. They reduce some staffing in the emergency center somewhat. The vulnerable ones had to stay home longer than others. So, so in the case of COVID-19 and response, I think that in a hurricane, it would be all hands on deck. We have had a whole set of educational sessions through kudos communication, talking about social distancing. We have PPEs, personal protective equipment. That's all. That's a part of us. Even before COVID-19, when we talk about PPEs, we talk about our helmet, our gloves, and what's not. Now the mask has become part of the PPE. So as a first responder and essential service, being impacted by COVID-19 and a disaster, I think we will have all hands on deck, and we will have to, as it is now the new norm. I think we understand we need to wear a mask. We have the alcohol, the Lysol, and all of that in the vehicles. So I think the response will be generally the same, except for those persons who are considered vulnerable. So, certain persons that are part of the vulnerable community would not be able to respond if they are indeed on the front line. But if it is a person who's vulnerable and we are able to set up, we talk about the communications, we're able to set up. Right now we have the call center working from at home. So persons can still respond the same way working from at home, answering the phones and what's not. So given that we are essential service, I would say we understand this is now the new norm and we have plans in place to deal with it.
We have another question from one of our Facebook followers. The lady with difference of COVID-19, what are the attitudes to natural and man-made disasters and pandemics? So is there a difference? Are you seeing any difference in people's attitudes now that we have to factor in COVID-19? Mr. Austin?
What are the difference between man-made and natural hazards and COVID-19?
Or are people
Before,
reacting different? Are people thinking about it different?
uh, yeah, COVID-19 definitely is an unknown. I think that's the biggest difference. Hurricanes, anything that happened with man, with a technological disaster, yeah, we understand them more. We know what they are. We can grasp them. But with COVID-19, and the biggest thing about COVID-19 is that although we want to respond, right? We are now responding to something now that actually really can kill us, right? I think that's the biggest difference for any frontline worker, right? When it comes to COVID-19, as to a storm or to any going to a fire, right? You know those risks. You sum up those risks quite clearly, and then you work to suit. But with COVID-19, you know everything was changing rapidly as the onset came about. So no one was sure what to expect. So all that, anxiety, putting people on edge, those were the big differences I would say in the COVID-19 as opposed to, the normal, hazards that we prepare for and how we would view them and how we would respond to them.
Okay, we have another question. We actually running out of time, so let's ask and let's see if we can get our answer quickly. Get one question. This is for Dr. Archer. Is power likely to shut down the service in the event of extremely severe weather, and how will this impact communication?
Yeah, right. So we will make the call from the generation perspective. They will make the call, and if we need to shut down, shut down. And if we have to shut down, how it impacts communication, I'm not sure from a telecommunications perspective. I know that some cell sites might have a battery, so it would depend on how long the shutdown is. Some cell sites will have batteries and generators, and so I think that eventually it would affect communication, because I know in my area, if the electricity goes off, I know my internet does not work, depending on the cell site or the is a cell site? Yes, the cell site or the telecommunications site that's in the area. But I know that cable and wireless, from working from them before, there are some sites that have generation batteries and UPS, but that will only last so long. But
Right.
I am sure
Okay.
that they will
And
have their response plans too. They will have, similar to Light and Power, they will have a hurricane response plan for communications in the event of loss of power.
okay, so we have probably time for one last question, and it's going to be for all three of you. One Facebook follower says, as a Barbadian watching other Caribbean islands deal with devastation, I often wonder, are we ready? How will we deal with a disaster should it strike? So I'm going to ask you all to answer that on behalf of your various organizations, and bearing in mind that we don't have very much time left.
Preparation is the key. I think that's in a nutshell. Prepare as much as you possibly can, and once you're prepared, then you're better able to handle the impacts.
And part of
Okay.
that training is to you need to be aware of the environment in which you are in, and to have a good understanding of what is the likely impact, because you can prepare, you can either under, or I wouldn't say you can over, but have a good understanding as to those hazards that are likely to impact you. I think that can help focus where your training and your preparedness needs will be. But we must start to prepare more effectively and more in a broad base for all events, not only just the hurricanes.
Right. I would say
And
we as
Dr. Archer.
I would say we are very much prepared, because we have had the opportunity opportunity or the lessons learned from Grand Bahamas and Dominica to help us tweak our hurricane plans. So I would say that we are very much prepared.
Mhm. But of course, you cannot be too prepared. That is,
Correct.
it cannot happen. So, well, I guess then we can wrap up with one last statement from everybody. We have 2 minutes left. What, if I can ask this one last question, what do you want to see Barbadians do on their part to be ready in the event of a system?
If I can go first,
Yeah, I think
okay, go
it's
ahead.
just to take
Go
things
ahead.
slowly. Sometimes through complacency, we may not think it's serious, but as Dr. Archer would have said when she viewed the devastation in Dominica and stuff like that, I've been through a number of storms myself. Real talk, you don't want to see a Category 3 or something like that storm hit Barbados. No way.
Mr. Brooks?
In terms of, let us come together and recognize challenges that can come to us, and seek the relevant help from those stakeholders and our communities, and build the level of resilience that we will be able to at least have less respond to, and therefore our recovery will be significantly less. But we need to raise the bar and how we are preparing.
Dr. Archer, the last 20 seconds are yours.
Right, so I would take off my Light and Power hat, and I would say definitely the key thing you should also have, along with supporting the others, is to have a plan for your family. You see, that experience from Dominica, not knowing, if your mother is good or your father is good, is to have that family plan for a hurricane. To know how you will communicate, if you will be together, which house you will write it out at, choose the right house, so you will have as much of your family together as possible.
Thank you very much. I'd like to say thanks to our panel, Dr. Nneka Archer, the engineering manager at the Barbados Light Power Limited, Mr. Selwyn Brooks, consultant at the Department of Emergency Management, and Mr. Richard Austin, disaster management officer at the Barbados Red Cross. And we were also joined by is interpreting for the deaf. And this has been another in the series, the webinar, Real Talk in the Face of Danger, sponsored by the Department of Emergency Management and the Barbados Light Power Company Limited. Thank you all, our panelists. Thank you very much, our Facebook followers, all of our social media followers, for joining us for another webinar. Good night.
Thanks all. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Disasters can happen at any time with very little and sometimes no warning. Hurricanes, earthquakes, tsunamis, flood, volcanoes, tornadoes, and fire are a fresh reminder that hazards can strike at any time, and no area of the country is immune. Whenever a hazard is approaching or occurring, take the necessary precautions to keep you and your family safe and sound. Pay close attention to all bulletins and updates from the Department of Emergency Management, and make sure you have an adequate supply of non-perishable items, medication, and plenty of water, as well as knowing the location of your nearest emergency shelter. Disasters can occur in the blink of an eye. The right precautions could save your life. Prepare and be aware. This message is brought to you by the Department of Emergency Management.